We wait for a couple of minutes because it's a new venue. For the first time we are here in the University Club, so there are some other people that is going to come and to move along the bridge under the sun. And we are waiting for the discussant Stefano Lucarelli to show. But in a couple of minutes we start. Too, so just to save time we can start because we are a little bit in delay. We have to finish about 4:30, 4:40 p.m. So this is the first thematic session after plenary session in the other venue, the central building of the university. The title of this session is The Multi-Path of Capitalistic Development, Proletarization, Migration and the Labor Market. You can see from the title that the topic is quite wide. Of course, we cannot be exhaustive about all the part of the discussion could arise from this kind of issue. We organize the session in this way. I give a brief presentation of this thematic session, then we'll start each presentation following the order. After each presentation, the discussant will provide no more than a couple of questions for each presentation, and the answer to the discussant opinions will be given after the presentation together with the debate. I recommend each presentation to stay in no more than 15, 16, maximum 16 and 30 minutes. In any case, we think that if not everything is said during the presentation, in the reply to the discussion, of course, there is enough time to add the further information and points. So, my task here as chair of this session is quite tough and hard, because by joking I was saying that I try to make possible what is impossible. It is to find some common points in 4 presentations that are very heterogeneous. They talk with special case studies in different territorial zones all over the world. And that is quite normal, I think, because the analysis of the governance of labor markets, the composition of labor, the role by migrations, the path towards proletarianization in different periphery and semi-periphery of the world just shows how the capitalistic command is articulated in a different way with a different degree of intensity and characteristic and specificities. I do not enter in the detail of each paper because that is the task of the presenter. I can say that the first paper has to do with the ambiguity, I can use this word, about commodity chains deriving from Arrighi analysis, with a specific case about the laguna in north central Mexico. The second, this paper is presented by Jennifer Baer of University of Virginia. The second paper has to do with the governance of internal migration in China from rural areas to urban areas. And it is interesting to notice that the paper is focused on the type of welfare that has to do with this kind of labor composition internal to China. This paper is presented by Michele Mastandrea, I'm very honored to say that is independent research. And we have to focus that it's better to be independent than academic, on my opinion. The third point, the third argument is about another area, from Mexico to China. Now from China we go back to South America. It's about what the author called authoritarian neoliberalisms, and is about the different type of dispossession, we can say, and about different conditions in South America, from Chile, Argentina, and other countries. The first paper is completely different. From South America, we go to Mediterranean context, especially Sardinia, and here the paper is about the analysis of the different transitions from a peripheral development inside the new globalization trends by researching 3 peculiar areas. So you can see that this paper is completely different, completely heterogeneous. Just reading this paper, I try in the last day to find a sort of fil rouge, a common point. I propose 3 common points, and then my speech is over. The first one has to do with that all the cases that are analyzed, or the different constants, in any case belongs to a sort, what we can call a southern belt. China, South America, Central America, Sardinia is south of Europe, in any case, Mediterranean area. And with southern belt can be considered opposed to a sort of northern belt. It was a sort of geo-economic belt that is from USA to Russia, through UK after Brexit, we can say. Europe is just in the middle. It's some situation that is need, of course, to be analyzed if we look in the recent year to the new reconfiguration of geo-economic before its geopolitical redefinition. In the video that we saw yesterday, remembering the speech by Giovanni Arrighi about 11 years ago in this university, Giovanni Arrighi just 11 years ago recognized that the south of the world can not only be considered as a south developed with respect to a developed north, but the south was able in that time to become more and more autonomous and advance in terms of technology, capacity to control international economic flows, and to be in the next year probably to be at the center of a sort of financial transition from the West traditional stock exchange to the Eastern stock exchange. So each paper, and that is a common point, is about this kind of in the different contexts to analyze how, which kind of contradictories, which kind of problematic nodes are present in this evolution towards a higher degree of autonomy of the South, of this southern belt. The second point is to do with the co-presence of what I prefer to use different modes of subsumption of labor to capital. I think that here could be important to highlight it. Maybe it's a sort of question I can do towards the papers, a sort of differentiation between the concept of accumulation in Marxian tradition and the concept of valorization. The two words are different, of course. Accumulation is to do with the accumulation of capital. There are different theories about accumulation of capital. There is no time to highlight now, of course. And valorization has to do with the way in which the result of accumulation can be fixed in rent, if we talk about financial, or in profits. That means that accumulation does mean that there is immediately direct valorization. That is a problematic point of the structural crisis of capitalistic evolution. We have different kind of accumulation, valorization, that is different types of subsumption. There is dispossession, we already discussed yesterday with a paper about China. There is form of real and formal subsumption, according to the traditional Marxian theory. There is a role played by finance as form of valorization in terms of subsumption, direct subsumption of our life in a context of biopower of finance related to the new forms of contemporary capitalism. So this is a point that I think that is something that shows again how the capitalistic mode of production varies from a context to another, but can be recognized with some homogeneous point. The third common point that I just talk a lot, too much, is to do with a category that is normally was not used by Arrighi, but in my research field, inside what we can call the autonomous Marxism, is a concept that is very much used. It is the labor composition. In terms of technical and political composition of labor, that has to do with the role of semi-proletarialization, proletarialization, and the new divide inside new forms of labors and works, and now together with the new evolution of technology, how is possible to talk of homogeneous technical composition of labor. The problem is that if we look at the history of the cotton industry in North Mexico, by paper by Jennifer, the political composition of labor in a neoliberal authoritarian in the history of South America, it is the second paper, or how the welfare is used as tools of define a new composition of labor that has to do with migration from rural to urban areas in China. And in the same evolution in Sardinia, all these kind of very different contexts, and in any case linked to one each other, and pose a theoretical and empirical question. Is it possible today to find or to analyze a macro trend as it was used to do by Arrighi studies in terms of technical composition of labor? That is a very big question mark. And the last thing that especially referred to the paper by Domenica Farinella and Roberto Iba about Sardinia. I remember when I read this paper, I remember the analysis by Luciano Ferrari Bravo about the relation between periphery and core, and how the so-called at the time of the early 70s, the underdevelopment of periphery was one of the key factors of the growth of the core, of the center. That is something that is put in discussion nowadays with the new configuration of geo-economic relationship inside the new South and the new North. And that is another point, of course, that is present in all the paper. So, that is just to give some very quick inputs in order to faster discussion after the presentation. Now we can start. I hope that Stefano will hear because now... Okay, the first presentation is by Jenny Berber. Jenny Berber is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia. She received her PhD in Sociology from Duke University and a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from Johns Hopkins University. She is co-editor of Putting Labor in Its Place, Labor Process Analysis and Global Value Chains, published by Palgrave in 2015, and previously was editor of Frontier of Commodity Chain Research, published by Stanford University Press. So I give to Jennifer the presentation, to the word. Remember that you have 15 minutes. As Ken said, in the long run, we are all dead.
Very much for the introduction. I also like to thank Marta and Beverly and the rest of the conference organizing committee. It's really a huge honor to be here. What I'd like to do in this talk is begin to put into explicit conversation two nearly contemporaneous publications by Giovanni Arrighi. First, the landmark essay by Arrighi and Ostili that we've been discussing, and second, the piece that I think Beverly referred to yesterday as the Arrighi and Drangel article. In Capitalist Development in Hostile Environments, Arrighi and Ostili demonstrate not only that the development of a wage labor force can occur via multiple routes, but also that none of these routes guarantee economic development. Rather, they show that the three trajectories traced by different regions of Calabria do not lead to mobility and wealth of the Swiss, Prussian, or American varieties, but rather to peripheralization. And this should not surprise us, the authors conclude, because peripheralization and its obverse are macro processes of the world economy, which have only indirect and partly indeterminate connections with the microstructures of production and reproduction as they exist in a region like Calabria. Arrighi and Ostili conceptualize peripheralization as a process whereby some actors or locales that participate directly or indirectly in the world division of labor are progressively deprived of the benefits of such participation to the advantage of other actors or locales. It is here, in developing this argument about different mechanisms of peripheralization, that the authors cite the Arrighi and Drangel article entitled Stratification in the World System, which was published the preceding year in the journal Review. Arrighi and Drangel introduce the concept of commodity chains as mechanisms of stratification, and this is actually the same quote that we saw in an earlier presentation. Economic actors continuously endeavor to shift, and some succeed in shifting, the pressure of competition from themselves onto other actors. As a result, the nodes or economic activities in each and every commodity chain tend to become polarized into positions from which the pressures of competition has been transferred elsewhere, core-like activities, and positions to which pressure has been transferred, peripheral activities. So what I want to do in the talk is read these two pieces together in order to consider how commodity chains function as potentially hostile environments, and to think about the shifting dynamics of commodity chains, and in particular the cotton commodity chain, which I'm going to focus on, as an example of those macro processes of the world economy to which Arrighi and Ostili refer. So let's go to Mexico. I'm going to develop this idea via an analysis of a region of Mexico called La Laguna. La Laguna is a region of north-central Mexico that encompasses 15 municipalities, which are up there, that straddle actually two different states of Mexico, the state of Coahuila and the state of Durango. Cotton was first planted on a large scale in La Laguna in the 1860s, but it didn't really take off until the last quarter of the 20th century. Between 1875 and 1900, cotton production more than tripled, spurred by irrigation infrastructure and the arrival of the railroad, which integrated the region into national markets. By 1910, on the eve of the Mexican Revolution, La Laguna was producing approximately 90% of Mexico's total cotton crop. Although the cotton estates were referred to as haciendas, they differ dramatically from the traditional hacienda system found in much of central and southern Mexico. La Laguna's cotton farms were well-capitalized operations, relying mostly on wage workers, lacking access to land for subsistence production, and with limited local employment opportunities between the end of the harvest and the beginning of the spring planting season. Some workers migrated to the U.S. for work. Now, for the most part, the situation remained unchanged through the Mexican Revolution, which largely left the cotton estates untouched. In 1928, about 1/3 of the region's irrigated land was still owned by 6 individuals. Now, the second period in our history, around the second row, begins in the late 20s with an agricultural crisis triggered by poor harvests and exacerbated by the downturn in world markets after the 1929 crash. The area under cotton cultivation plummeted from 132,000 hectares in 1926 to 43,000 in 1932. And what had been chronic discontent with conditions on the cotton estates took a more organized form as La Laguna experienced a major upsurge in social mobilization. This local agrarian movement was, in reality, a broad alliance of rural and urban workers that also drew participants from the manufacturing and mining sectors. And its idiom of protest was at once industrial and agrarian. So laborers on the cotton estates referencing the constitutional provisions protecting industrial workers, petitioned their employers for a decent wage and freedom of association. But they simultaneously referenced the articles of the Mexican Constitution that enfranchised the peasantry, appealing to the government to recognize their status as producers with the right to the land grants enshrined in the Revolutionary Constitution of 1917. In the fall of 1935, sporadic strikes convulsed the region's cotton haciendas, and by spring, this wave of militancy culminated in a general strike when the estate owners refused to meet workers' demands for a collective contract providing higher wages and shorter working hours. With the conflict at an impasse and the Mexican government deeply concerned about the loss of the season's cotton crop, President Lázaro Cárdenas decided to intervene, announcing a major land reform. Within a matter of months, over 1 million hectares were expropriated from the cotton plantations, and the land was redistributed to some 38,000 families in the form of ejidos or communal farms. Some of it is actually expropriated and distributed by President Cárdenas himself. That's a picture of him there. And this expropriation and redistribution created a new class of land and agricultural producers. Now, the government did permit expropriated owners to retain 150 hectares of cotton, which they could continue to farm as pequeños propietarios or private producers. Yet, while not complete, the expropriation was far-reaching. Following the 1936 reforms, more than 3/4 of La Laguna's irrigated land was in the hands of ejidatarios. What made La Laguna's agrarian reform so notable was the fact that it involved productive and irrigated land in the country's chief commercial agriculture region. So unlike earlier expropriations, which basically established ejidos for small-scale subsistence production, the land reform in La Laguna created a new model, the collective ejido. The collectivization of cotton farming had a number of advantages. It ensured that scarce irrigation water was maximized. It secured the access of producers to expensive agricultural machinery, infrastructure, and inputs, and it facilitated the marketing and commercialization of the crop. The government further sought to reinforce the commercial orientation of La Laguna's ejidos by sharply limiting the amount of ejido land that could be used to grow subsistence crops. These efforts on the part of the state to shape the microstructures of production and reproduction in La Laguna reflected the importance of cotton, both as a revenue-generating export crop and a critical input for the country's textile industry during what was basically a nascent period of import substitution industrialization. Now, in the years immediately following the 1936 reform, it appeared as if President Cárdenas' gamble on collectivization might pay off. During the late 30s, the government was even optimistic that export revenue generated by increased cotton yields might allow it to repay a large loan from the Banco de Mexico. But La Laguna's fortune shifted in the 1950s. In 1955, the U.S. government announced that it would subsidize the export of a portion of its abundant cotton reserves. The Mexican government decried the decision, claiming that it amounted to an unfair dumping of 12 million bales of cotton on the world market. At the time, Mexico was cotton's chief agricultural export, and it was one of the world's largest exporters. Following the release of the U.S. cotton reserves, the Mexican government's earnings from cotton fell 25%, and they continued to fall throughout the decade, even as costs rose steadily. The decline in prices affected the private producers as well as the ejidatarios, but even as those pequeños propietarios began shifting to other activities, La Laguna's ejidatarios did not. So in a 1983 survey of the region's ejidos, researchers found that almost 2/3 of the region's hectares were still planted cotton. So why? We're in the fourth row now of this table. To explain the persistence of cotton production in La Laguna through the 1980s is really to understand the state-directed nature of agricultural production in the ejido sector, and especially the pivotal role played by the National Ejido Credit Bank, or just the bank. President Cárdenas established the bank because he recognized that a commercial ejido sector would require secure access to large amounts of credit. La Laguna's cotton ejidos, which were the centerpiece of Cardenista agrarian reform, received a disproportionate share of the credit extended by the bank. Alongside the bank, the other main institution in the ejido sector was the Central Union of Collective Credit Societies. The leaders of the Central Union were elected by ejidatarios to represent their interests vis-a-vis the government. But the more conservative presidents that succeeded Cárdenas began to worry that the Central Union might grow into a source of opposition to, or even political competition for, the state. So in order to counter the perceived threat that the Central Union represented, the bank began to encourage the decollectivization of the cotton ejidos. At the same time, though, it sought to ensure that ejidatarios continued to grow cotton, because even after it ceased to be economically profitable, cotton had political value. to the state. As a labor-intensive crop, it absorbed a relatively large amount of rural labor in a historically restive region. Accordingly, the bank ensured that ejido territorios continued to plant cotton simply by refusing to provide them with credit to grow anything else. The bank's short-term credits, or créditos diario, became especially critical to the reproduction of the ejido household. Now, formally, these credits were supposed to be advances on anticipated profits, but as costs rose and prices fell, it became clear there weren't going to be any profits. The payments essentially came to function as de facto wages paid by the state. Over time, ejido territorios became more indebted and thus more dependent on the bank, thus increasing the party state's control over ejido communities. And in this way, créditos diario were the primary mechanism underlying the particular form of cotton clientelism that functioned in La Laguna's countryside. And in work I've done with my friend Phil Howe, we actually compare La Laguna's cotton economy with the form of coffee clientelism that emerged in Colombia's coffee growing region, Viejo Palos, that you heard about yesterday in Phil's presentation. Now, the status quo prevailed in La Laguna until 1992, when President Carlos Salinas oversaw the passage of the new agrarian law, which changed the legal status of ejido land. Now, ejido territorios could convert what had been purely usufruct rights to outright ownership, allowing them then to rent or sell their land. These changes to the ejido regime were intended to modernize Mexico's moribund agricultural sector by jump-starting investments, particularly from foreign agribusiness. In Salinas' view, stimulating the market in land necessitated the withdrawal of credit from undercapitalized and inefficient ejido producers, and this worked. Between 1990 and 1992, the percentage of ejido territorios receiving credit for cotton in La Laguna fell from nearly 80% to 33%. While 66,000 hectares, a little over that, were still planted cotton in 1988, the year Salinas assumed the presidency, cotton cultivation in the region plummeted to just 8,000 hectares in 2000. So this brings us then to the fifth and final chapter in La Laguna's travels through the cotton commodity chain. Today, three livelihood strategies predominate in La Laguna: milk, migration, and maquilas. And these aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, most households combine more than one of these strategies. First, milk has replaced cotton as the new so-called white gold in the region. The origins of La Laguna's dairy economy actually stretch back to 1955, when some of those first pequeños propietarios, to diversify out of cotton, imported 240 dairy cattle from Canada. What is today the giant consortium of large dairy producers in the region, it's one of the biggest actually in either of the Americas. The company is known as Lácteos de la Laguna, or LALA. It grew over time by absorbing many of the region's private producers. And then in the 1990s, after the new agrarian law was passed, many ejido territorios began renting their land and their water rights, so the water rights are an important part of this story. They started renting this land to larger farmers who were growing fodder crops for Lala's dairy cows. Because fodder, mostly in this region alfalfa and sorghum, require much more water than cotton, this is already causing a serious ecological strain on what is a semi-arid region hit by periodic serious drought. But while fodder crops use far more water than cotton, they require much less labor, exacerbating problems of rural un- and underemployment. Large numbers of rural residents have migrated, the second M, many to urban areas within the region, such as La Laguna's largest city of Torreon, and others migrating longer distances. Now, at least for a time, some of this rural labor was also absorbed by the third M, maquilas. So maquilas are just export factories. They're the Mexican equivalent of what elsewhere are referred to as export processing zones or special economic zones in China. Particularly in the period between the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement in '94 and China's entry to the World Trade Organization, Mexico's export-oriented manufacturing sector experienced robust growth, and La Laguna was actually one of the epicenters of this growth. During the height of the export boom, maquilas could be found not just in La Laguna's big cities, but also throughout the countryside, including on the former cotton ejidos. And it was during my first trip to La Laguna in the late 1990s that I learned about these ejido maquilas and a program called Laguna 2000, or Laguna 2000. Laguna 2000 was the brainchild of a local clothing manufacturer in Torreon who pitched it directly to President Salinas. His proposal was to build factories that would be owned cooperatively by the ejido communities, that would work as subcontractors for the many clothing manufacturers in the region cities that were producing clothing, mostly blue jeans at the time, for major US brands like Levi's. Laguna 2000 nicely complemented the president's own vision of a modernized countryside with employment opportunities for the many rural producers that were being made redundant by the agrarian restructuring then just getting underway. So Salinas agreed to provide financial support for the project in the form of government loans from Mexico's Bank for Foreign Trade, and the first maquila was established under the Laguna 2000 program in 1992, the same year that the new agrarian law was passed. But Mexico's clothing exports to the US declined dramatically following the phase-out of quotas on the global garment trade in 2005. And the subcontracting orders that were supposed to keep these ejido maquilas operating dried up. In fact, it turns out that the so-called collective owners turned debtors never were able to pay off the loans from the government. Though many maquiladoras remain in La Laguna's urban core, the rural industrialization scheme envisioned in the Laguna 2000 blueprint never materialized. I want to close here by observing that the ejido maquila, I think, is a particularly dramatic example of how microstructures of production and reproduction, forged through social change, become uneasily articulated into the environment of new commodity chains. As in Calabria, social conflict is what propelled social change in La Laguna, and this struggle, culminating in the 1936 land reform, did indeed improve the life prospects and well-being of many of the region's rural residents. And I think this goes back to something that Ricardo said yesterday in his presentation, I think one can and should ask what the implications are for the present, in a political sense, of the historical memory of this conflict for the region's remaining ejidatarios and rural workers.